Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Tamara, aka Mrs. Thinker, and today we'll be looking at rounding off numbers. Now last week I did a video on significant figures and I felt like rounding was the perfect next step. So without any further delay, let's go.
Hey you, over there. I see you struggling with the numbers, but don't have no fear, cause I'm right here. We're gonna grow and learn together, there's no need to despair. Math cool like breeze, you're gonna learn it with ease. So leave your concerns because it's time to learn.
Okay, so first things first, why do we round numbers? In the most practical sense, rounding is used to provide estimates, so we may not be aware of what the exact number is because, some number just complex and love going with themselves, right? But we would still want to give a good estimate of what the number is. And we all know that rounding is top of a Jamaican's vocabulary because, we ever round things. Yeah, man, give me about 10 pound of goat, or yo boss, let off 1 grand per minute. All you need about 50 chicken, my youth, to start the business. But yeah, what I'm trying to say is rounding is a Jamaican's middle name. So if you don't catch the style yet, let me show you how it's done. So when we round numbers, there are 2 key things to note. First thing is what place value are you rounding to, right? So they might ask you to round something to the nearest 10, hundreds, thousand, the millions, tenths, as in decimals, yeah. So that's number 1. And I feel like at this point, I should bring in an example before getting to the second point. So here goes. Our example is round 674 to the nearest 10. Now, the second point is that rounding to the nearest place value group means that that group will have the last non-zero digit number once the rounding is completed, because every number to the right of it is an estimate, right? So it will be 0. So in our example, we are rounding to the nearest 10. So this means that the number in the ones place value group will be 0. We already know that already, right? It also means that the number in the place value group that we're rounding to, so in this case tens, will either remain the same or increase by 1. If it remains the same, we say that we round it down. If it increases by 1, we say we round it up. How do we determine whether it stays the same or increases by 1? We look at the number directly beside it. That is directly to the right of it. Okay? So here's the step-by-step version now. We're going to underline our 7 because that is in the place value group we're rounding to, right? Then we are going to look right next to it in the ones place value group, and we are going to look at whether that number is less than, equal to, or greater than 5. Now, if that number is less than 5, we round down by keeping the 7 as is, so we don't do anything to it. But if the number is 5 or greater, then we round up by adding 1 to our 7. In this case, 4 is less than 5. So we keep the 7 as is, we round down basically, and like I said, everything else will go to 0. So our rounded number is 670. Notice how in this case we don't really care about the 6 in the hundreds place. Listen, it could have been a 6, it could have been an 8, a 4, or an octopus. When rounding, all we really focus on is the place value group that we're rounding to and the number directly beside it. Now, with a slight change, let's make it 678 rounded to the nearest 10. Again, we're going to underline our tens place value group because that's the group we're rounding off to. Then we look directly beside it and see. Now the number next to it is greater than 5. So we increase the 7 by 1 and replace the numbers following it with 0. And so our final rounded number is 680. And that's the basic rules for rounding. But that's the math side of things, right? Now for the logic behind it, the reasoning behind it. Let's say you were at school and you did a test, right? And you have to go home and tell your mother how much you get. No, obviously you want your mother to believe that you did well on this test, right? So if you got like a 78, so 78 is really close to 80. So you could round up to the 80 now and say, Mom, I got a 80% and everything is good. That's a A, all is well. But if you got like a 74, In terms of tens, 74 is much closer to 70 than it is to 80. So you cannot round up to 80. You would more likely have to round down to 70. And that's really the principle of rounding. You either round up or round down to what it's closer to. If you go to the shop with a $135 and them ask you, how much $100 you have? You would say, I have around $100 because the 35 is so much closer to 100 than it is to 200. It's not even anywhere close to 200. No, if you had $175, no, that sounds a lot closer to the 200. So if you gotta round up now and say, boy, I'm about $200. And then the standard to determine which point you round up or round down is the number 5. So again, once the number is less than 5, we're rounding down, but once it is 5 or greater, we round up. So let's get into a few examples. So our first example is 44,567,390 rounded to the nearest 1,000. So the digit that's in the 1,000 place value group is 7. So we underline the 7. We look directly to the right of it and we look at that number. Now, is that number less than 5 or greater than or equal to 5? Well, 3 is less than 5. So we know we're rounding down. So we're leaving the 7 as is, and everything else to the right of that 7 goes to 0. So our rounded number is 44,567,000. Now the next example, 479.578 rounded to the nearest 1. So the digit that's in the 1 place value group is 9. So we underline the 9, look directly beside it. Doesn't matter that there's a decimal point. The next digit to the right of the 9 is 5. Now because it's 5, we're gonna round up by adding 1 to the 9. Now listen, do not be scared, because so 1 plus 9 is 10, so you probably wonder what is gonna happen. We're adding 1 to the entire number technically, right? So 9, when you add 1 to it, it ends up going over to the next place value group based on addition principles. So when we add 1 to the 9, well, if we're adding 1 to 479, it's gonna be 480. But by adding 1 to the 9, it gives 10, which means that 0 goes into the 1's place value group. We add 1 to the 10's place value group, and then 1 plus 7 is 8, and we still end up with 480. Now we're not done yet, because remember, everything else to the right of the 1's place value group has to go to 0. So our final rounded number is 480.000. Now on to our third example. 76 rounded to the nearest 100. Now this is slightly different, because if you realize now, there is no 100 place value in the number 76. But in this case, you could say, okay, we can put a 0 as the 100 place value, because that doesn't change the value of the number. So if we're going to put a placeholder, we can always put a 0 there and work with it like that. So if we underline the 0 now, we're going to look over to the next place value group, and we're going to say 7 is greater than 5. Therefore, we're rounding up. Now, by rounding up, we add 1, right? So 1 plus 0 is 1, and everything else goes to 0, and we end up with 100. Now, the principles that I've outlined can work with any number. But if you think about it logically, 76 in terms of hundreds is much closer to 100 than it is to 0. As a matter of fact, 76 is greater than 50. So it means that 76 rounded up to the nearest 100 would be the first one, 100. Now, 76 rounded to the nearest thousands. So again, using the principle, we just put in zeros as placeholders. Yeah, we'll underline the thousands place value group, which in this case is 0. The number next to it is 0. Is 0 less than 5? Yes, 0 is less than 5. So by rounding down, everything goes to 0, and we're left with 0. And we'll not leave them one bag of 0 there. It's just 0, right? So 76 rounded to the nearest 1,000 is 0. Again, from the logical standpoint, if we're looking at 0 versus 1,000, 76 is much closer to 0 than it is to 1,000. So if we're rounding, say it has to round down to 0. Now for our final example. 4,598.52972 rounded to the nearest 100th. Okay, so the number in our 100th place value group is 2. So we underline the 2. We look directly beside it. 9 is greater than 5, so we round up by adding 1 to the 2, making it 3, and then everything else goes to 0. And so our rounded number is 4,598.53. Alright, so I feel like I've equipped you guys with all the tools to properly go forth into the world and round off some numbers like a true Jamaican. Not only that, but hear this now. If you see anybody doing it incorrectly, like for example, Mas Joe gave some money for send go give your mother and him say, may I send you about $600 for give your mother. You're looking at your hand and you say it's actually $670. You can be like, Mas Joe, this are more like $700 because $670 is closer to $700 than it is to $600. So what you must do, you must round up to $700 instead of rounding down to $600. So we can teach people, look at things about rounding. Well, obviously being respectful, because it's always good to be respectful. Okay, guys, enough of my stories. Listen, this is not a video if my story they're in there, right? But enough of that. Let's recap today's lesson. Rounding was made to correctly estimate numbers and can be done based on the different place value groups. When rounding a number to a particular place value group, we focus on both that number and the number directly beside it to the right, and using 5 as our marker to determine whether we round it down by leaving the number as is or round up by adding 1 to the number. And that's it, guys, for today's video. Remember to like this video if you enjoyed it, comment below if you learned something new, and finally, be a friend and tell a friend. Remember, we're all in this together because math is life.